All right, it is. All right, it is the day after Easter, and I've just finished reading Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon. This version is translated by Daphne Hardy. This is a book that I think was initially published in the 1950s and then translated in the 1960s. I think I got those dates correct. And is about the Moscow trials. And it's basically a fictionalized telling of a couple different stories that are condensed into one narrative. This is at a time in Russian history, if I remember correctly, that they have tried to go through the Tenet system, and that didn't work. And then we get to the initial communist revolution, which does work, and then this is in the period of time after the first revolution, in which we are looking at kind of the changing from the old guard and the initial leaders of the revolution into the new guard. And Rubashov is one of the members of the old guard who is now being executed as they bring in the new guard. And I mean, this book is difficult to read because, number one, it is a translated work, and therefore you get some really hyper-specific and kind of roundabout ways of describing things because the words don't quite match up. And then also, it is a book that is, in its base, about government and economic philosophy, and so it's just dense, right? It's still a very enjoyable book. I think this is probably my third time reading it. I think I read it twice in high school. So that's that. I would say probably the really interesting thing here is just the general concept of the old guard and the new guard. I think I've talked about this before, in which there's this idea that the people that get you to be in charge are not the people that keep you in charge. And so when you're looking at the kind of the initial founders of the revolution, Rubashov is a part of it. And what begins happening is a conceptual idea and a conceptual split in which the main leader of the party wants to keep a very defensive, nationalistic view of communism. Basically, what this character's, they're referred to as number one, feeling is that the revolution has succeeded, but there is a lot of pushback from Western countries, and therefore they must first just weather the storm and show that this system works before they can try to incite revolutions in other countries. And Rubashov and a lot of the other characters that we meet in the book are more on the aggressive, offensive side. The concept being that the way that Russia is founded and created, there is not a efficient way to keep the country alive, and so, or alive in the beginnings of implementing the communist system. And therefore what should be happening is Russia should be aggressive and incite other revolutions so that there are more countries and more areas of land and more resources to then spread throughout Russia and other countries. And I think that at its core is the big issue here. of the split, because they even like characters like Bagrov, who what his thing that he gets arrested for and then executed for is because he is a proponent of large submarines instead of small compact ones. And the reasoning for it that is given by Ivanov, who is a military general, is that bigger submarines are a sign of aggression, and smaller submarines are more of a sign of coastal defense. And therefore, because Bagrov is such a big proponent of large submarines, he has to be removed and executed. So that at its core is the big internal struggle of all of this. However, what we also begin to see is this moralistic fight between logic and empathy. Because at its core, communism and Marxism is based on logical deduction that resources should not determine whether a person is able to live, right? And so, like, that's a very, very simplistic view of the core value of that. And so everything that communist structure tends to do is look at things, try to look at things very, very logically, in a very logical deduction sort of way. And that works as long as you're not devolving into totalitarianism, which is what Russia ended up doing. And it's because of this concept of needing to progress industry at a rate that had never been done before in history. Because from a moralistic standpoint, when the railroads and textile industries and everything were implemented in Russia, and we had hundreds of thousands of deaths from those, and we had people dying of starvation. Moralistically, that is in the wrong, right? But from a communistic standpoint and from a logical deduction standpoint, that is to be expected, because this industry is only, at the time, 10 years old in Russia, and therefore, logically, not everything is going to be safe, and people are going to get killed for it. Because that was the same way that it was when places like Britain first introduced their major industries and railroads. The difference being that when Russia is doing it, they're doing it at a time in which there's sudden publicity on what they are doing, which, like, in terms of pure absolute logic, makes sense. But anyone who has, I think, been exposed to kind of empathetic and any sort of moralistic standards would say, oh, that's not right. You're not doing the right thing here, because what you're doing is hypocritical. And that's really what kind of one of the big bases of a totalitarian communist area is there's this belief that everyone should be equal, and no one should be higher than anyone else, but someone has to be making decisions for that, and someone has to be approving or disapproving things, and that person is not a frontline worker. That person is someone who is very hands-off in terms of the actual labor of things. And we get this kind of concept a lot actually throughout the book. We get that Rubashov, specifically the one that gets brought up a lot, is Rubashov sacrificing Arlova. Arlova is Rubashov's secretary at one point, and he basically sacrifices her and her life so that he may continue living. And the concept being that they're still in the early days of the revolution, and it was more important to have Rubashov alive to the party than it was to have Arlova alive to the party, which makes logical sense in the fact that Arlova is his secretary and does not show to have any ideas of her own, and Rubashov is a leader of the party and is coming up with ideas on how economic reform should work and things like that. But at the same time, that is also hypocritical against the communist standards of one person should not be able to sacrifice someone else's life because all people are equal. So that, you know, there's a lot of pointing out of the hypocritical practices of a government that works on the reliance of the inherent equality of people. So that's that. One of the very interesting things, that concept that comes up, is the idea of the old guard versus the new guard. And the old guard remembers a time before the revolution and had fought directly in the Civil War that led to the revolution. And so they have these kind of implemented in their minds. No matter how logical they want to be, they still have this kind of Christian moralistic principle that exists in their head. Compared to the old guard, or compared to the new guard. The new guard does not remember a time of the revolution, of before the revolution or during the revolution. They're either incredibly young when the revolution happens, or they were not born yet. And so they don't understand what it's like to have lived before that time, right? And so when you look at the methods and the way that they're willing to treat one another, there's this pretty significant difference. Because from a top-down perspective, a revolution has just happened. And so you have to be willing to do whatever it takes to keep that power after the revolution, because now there's a power vacuum. And so you need to squash anyone that is not on your side. And this gets taken to a very extreme manner, in which it's not only not anyone that's not on your side, but anyone who has the slightest disagreement with you. And that really becomes that initial response, which makes logical sense in communistic standpoint. That conclusion then leads to totalitarianism, because what has happened is you've completed a revolution in which now you have to squash anyone and liquidate anyone. That's the term that they use, physical liquidation. That is not 100% on your side. And therefore, you're running into this problem of which we have ran a revolution in which it is about the equality of resources and of people, and yet we are having to listen to the whims and the decisions of one person, and the rest of the country just has to follow that one person. And so we then get totalitarianism and authoritarianism in communism. And so looking at like the old guard has a remembrance of what times were before the revolution, and therefore they make the mistake of arguing or make the mistake of pitching any other idea, because that is what life was like before the totalitarianism comes in. And because of the logical deductions that are made and are required to be made in communism, well then therefore all these people have to be executed no matter what their digression was, right? And then you have the new guard that comes in. The new guard has only ever lived in this new world, and therefore the only thing that they understand from a political standpoint is that whatever number one says goes, and anyone who disagrees is a dissenter and therefore should be executed. Right? Like that is what the new guard that is coming in has the mentality of, because to them there has never been any other way of thinking. And because a lot of your new guard that is being brought in are people like Gletkin, they have every reason to fully believe that what is happening is positive. Because Gletkin comes from a very, very poor province of Russia, and therefore received no education, no training until he was an adult and the revolution had reached his village. And so Gletkin sees the benefits of the revolution and therefore is fully and wholeheartedly on board with everything that number one says, because he has no choice but to be, because of how beneficial it was to his village. And because of that, right, he will do anything for number one and will just follow orders because of the personal benefit that the village has gotten because of the revolution. And the other important thing to note is that the history has been consistently rewritten and consistently retold and erased, which is a very kind of classic totalitarianism, authoritarianism thing to do, which is to contest anything that is not pleasurable and is against a strict value, and label as propaganda. In the current climate that I'm living in, that is in essence what is happening right now in certain states, is the intentional removal and just the intentional removal and refusal to teach certain things in classrooms because of a moralistic objection to them, right? That's that. I finally, I guess, important thing to know is, once again, along this kind of moralistic versus logical debate, one of the debates that ends up happening here is just the concept of a life for life, right? Which in a communistic standard makes very much sense, because one life should not be more valuable than another life. And Rubashov agrees with this wholeheartedly until we get to Bagrov being taken in front of Rubashov's cell and then eventually executed. And in that moment, and seeing Bagrov, Rubashov makes the decision that one life is not inherently equal to one life anymore. And so we're kind of left in this thing in which we have the more complicated version of the trolley problem, in which I think for the majority of us, we would absolutely say, yes, we have to, if we have the opportunity to have less people die, that is more beneficial, right? But how many lives do we have to save, and how many lives is a person worth if that person is incredibly close to us, right? How many people would we have to say are going to get hit by the trolley in order for us to intentionally kill our best friend, right? And Ivanov basically has a kind of rebuttal to this, in which he's fully on board with the idealism that one life equals one life, and points to war as an example. And Rubashov then replies, well, war is an extraordinary circumstance. And Ivanov then says, well, no, actually not, because we are way more likely to be at war per year than we are to not be at war, as kind of a collective humanity. And this communistic idea of one life inherently equaling one life only, I think in a modern sense, only works if we are distant from the situation and it is inherently an extraordinary situation. But in, I would argue, the real working world that we live in, this one for one is not inherently the case, just from a philosophical standpoint. And because most of us are not involved in extraordinary situations, and most of us are not involved in, right, if we have a closeness to it, there inherently implies that there's something more there. And then again, the philosophical debate of, well, how many people does it take? How many other people that you do not know is worth the life of someone that you do know? I'm sure there's a lot more to say about this book that I'm just not thinking of right now. It's really interesting. It's really fascinating. I really do love it. It's just a dense book with a lot of things to think about. So that is Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon.